saying some of my own thank yous actually as well. So first of all to David, who really keeps things going and going at quite a rate in terms of the centre, the seminar series, the conference. I did put here actually that I've had the opportunity to be engaged with the conference planning with David, and then remembered that I'd not actually done very much at the moment, so I don't want to claim that. I will make up for it as we get into the conference, I promise that. So actually I think if we could just have another round of applause for David for all the work, the seminar, conference, all the energy and commitment that go into CCDS. So thanks to David, and also I'm working with David in his capacity as a mentor. So although I like to engage with research, have published some work and feel serious, I am serious about my research, but I also have the privilege of being mentored by David, and I've really appreciated that this year, and particularly we talked about that opportunity to co-edit the book we might not have mentioned, Disability Avoidance in the Academy. Did we mention that already?
Yeah.
Second, did we mention that? The book? Yeah. Second book. Okay. I'd also, though, like to thank colleagues in the department, and actually colleagues in the faculty, but particularly colleagues in the department. We do, well, I talk a lot. Some of you have to listen a lot, but we do have lots of conversations on a daily basis about the work, about people's passion and commitment for the work. It's just brilliant to be able to come to work with people and to be able to talk around those things. And because of that, that feeds, although we have a lot of time working on our teaching, but it really does feed me in terms of my ideas and thinking about the research. So engaging with legislation and bringing that to our students and making me think about how I want to work with that in my sort of research approaches. So I would like to thank our students, past and present, actually, without whom we wouldn't be here. I have to say at this point, hello Sophie, who'll be watching this on YouTube. Hi. But to the rest of you as well, the students who are here and who are continuing with us, sometimes from undergraduate, postgraduate and beyond in Ella's case as well. And so that's brilliant. So I'm really proud of the achievements of our students, and also I feel that we all continue to learn a lot from working with you. So that's super. So I'll move now to my presentation. The context for this was around the most recent changes to legislation in special education. And that came from the move where there was the coalition government in 2010, which swiftly moved into legislative changes from 2011 onwards, and there was a whole range of consultative processes. So that's the context for this work, and I'm looking at, as the title suggests, I'm looking at that idea around voice, collaboration, and the way that that's appropriated, which is what I want to explore through thinking about that in terms of voice collaboration, the appropriation of voice, how voice is used in policy formation. So I'll just explain, this first image is a collage that I made in thinking about the new approach, thinking about highlights from in the draft consultation process. And that first consultation document that was issued in 2011, Support and Aspiration. So I'm going to focus on a very, very small part of that piece in terms of the whole documentation. I'm going to focus on the forward. But I do just want to use this collage just to draw attention to some of these key ideas that I want to explore. So it's a draft for consultation there being a key word. Also thinking about this idea about new. So it was advocating there was going to be a new approach to legislation. A focus there is a clearer focus on the views of children and young people and their role in decision making. So this was something that led this policy formation, was around the views of children and young people and how they were able to inform decision making. Again, ideas around joint planning, close cooperation, coordination, a lot of this emphasis of or what I'm going to talk about in terms of being with this idea of cooperation. So there's a greater focus on support that enables those with SEN to succeed in their education and make a successful transition to adulthood. And in further work is worth exploring that notion of adulthood through policy is recognised as moves through education into employment. I'm not going to focus on that aspect of employability and independence, but I am going to focus on this notion of cooperation, consultation, coordination. You get the drift. It's around that focus. So I will read parts of the paper. I'll also just want to discuss some of the images that I decided to include. And I've gone with the use of the collage because my background is in art design education. I'm really interested in the ways that people from a disciplinary perspective read policy. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that in the introduction. Too frequently we think about special education policy as something very discrete and disconnected. So I'm quite interested in reading that as somebody who's coming from an art education perspective. So this presentation offers an exploration of the appropriation of voice in the creation of a collaborative emphasis in recent policy formation. I want to argue that voice, with its inherent associations with emancipation work and empowerment, has been harnessed in order to create compelling arguments for change, which appear to be driven by austerity measures taken forward by the last coalition government. In recent policy proposals relating to SEN, there appears to be a concern with. So in coordination, working together, consultation, which comes from calling together, cooperation, again, working together. But attempts to include voice for collaborative change also reinforce these points of separation and othering. So I'm going to explore the idea of with collaborative emphasis, but the ways that that can operate as an individualising and separatist sort of discourse as well. So the talk will have 5 parts. Actually, somebody did this the other week and I thought it was a great way of enabling people to hang on to something as you were sort of going on a little bit too much. So the first part is an introduction, which I'm partway through, quite brief. The second part is quite long. This is where I'm going to talk about my concern with and an argument for reading policy formation in SEN through and with art and design education. The third part includes a reading from support and aspiration from the foreword, so that's reasonably short. And the next section 4 is around appropriation and the idea of appropriation of voice in order to develop dialectical collaboration. That's slightly longer. And then to the conclusion. When it comes to conclusion, you will know that's really short. It's a very short conclusion. Okay. So, is everybody okay? So we'll proceed. I'm going to just put this slide up next. Sorry. Okay. So this is the urinal, a famous piece of artwork that was presented, actually first worked on this in 1915, Marcel Duchamp. But he presented it and it was displayed in 1917. And this is quite an iconic piece of artwork. I'll explain the connections with this now. Recent policy in special educational needs and disability has been formulated through a series of consultative processes, apparently designed to arrive at a new approach for educational provision. In the development of new policy for SEND, collaboration, voice and choice are appropriated in order to strengthen the case for change. Appropriation is concerned with the deliberate act of taking something for one's own use, the allocation of financial resources, and as an art term that refers to the reuse of existing objects that are presented in a form which is barely changed from their original. And this is the example of Marcel Duchamp's presentation of a men's urinal as fountain in 1917. So this is one of the most famous examples of that. Of particular concern here is the ways in which collaboration, voice and choice have been appropriated in calls to remake education policy and practice as something new. Here I explore the extent to which the appropriation of collaboration, voice and choice has resulted in the originality and authenticity of something new, or if the result is a representation of the pre-existing and problematic object of the child with special educational needs. So I'm problematising throughout that connection of the child with special educational needs. Special educational needs, I said. Needs. I'm considering the irony of voice in collaborative policy formation and the ways that it's harnessed to confirm a framework for pedagogic separation. Okay, so a lot of talk around collaboration, but there's still those conflicting ideas around separation. So, into part 2, and my concern with, or an argument for reading policy formation in SEN through and with art and design education. I came to Hope following the successful completion of my PhD on dyspraxia and drawing as a dominant practice in compulsory art and design education in 2011. I came with quite a limited knowledge on reflection of the field of disability studies, but a strong desire to question and disrupt the discourse of special education wherever I found it. And I saw it in the title of the undergraduate course at Hope and came to educate others with my critical perspectives. It didn't take me long to realise that my colleagues were quite a long way ahead of me in that respect. I'm first and foremost, though, an educator with an interest in art and design education and in compulsory education in the UK. And it's important to recognise that my research interest in disability studies comes from that perspective as an educator, but as also somebody who's an art and design educator. So in considering the intersection between SEN and art and design education, I'm seeking to offer a contextualised interrogation. I'm arguing here that practices relating to SEN result in an abstraction of learning and the learner through this process of decontextualisation. I therefore have an interest in reading policies relating to SEN with and through art and design education. So I'm going to discuss the arguments for that now. And I've drawn on the work of Jean-Luc Nancy, French philosopher, and particularly on his work on being singular plural, where he applies what's described as a relational ontology. And I'm going to draw on that to form my argument against these separate discussions of policy formation for special education. So I'll now briefly outline Nancy's work and make my argument for a shared reading of art education and policy formation in SEN. So I'm going to start with a quote from Nancy where he describes as existence is with, otherwise nothing exists. And I've got an image here of an old gate, but the most important bit here is the twine around the central part of the gate, this idea of knotting and bringing things together within the knots, which I'll talk about when I sort of explore Nancy's work. So existence is with, otherwise nothing exists, this relational ontology that he describes. So I would argue there's a problem with the separation of discussions about education policy and SEN policy, since this reinforces an acceptance of the very notions of exceptionality that critical disability studies attempts to resist. Margaret Sheldrick explains that critical disability studies makes an active demand to, quote, rethink the relations between disabled and non-disabled designations, not just ethically, as has long been the demand, but ontologically, right at the heart of the whole question of self and other. So the idea that we're working with ideas around ontology in terms of the ways that people are positioned as disabled and non-disabled, that we're thinking about that, but the way we think through, the way that policy is formulated and embedded very deeply in that respect. Policy formation and policy concerning the education of children with so-called special educational needs exist as a parallel track. It may be argued, therefore, that policy analysis are subject to what Sheldrick describes as their own illusory standards. And this separation in policy is confirmed and reinforced by texts that discuss SEN and education as separated concerns. So some examples here would be in the education debate, a key text around policy by Stephen Ball, where he offers a very, very brief commentary, literally 2 paragraphs, on recent changes to special education policy, acknowledging that he cannot do justice to the complexity of the discussion. in comparison to Sally Tomlinson's work, where she offers an extensive, thorough, and therefore separate discussion of policy relating to special education. The pragmatic rationalisation for a specialist and in-depth study of the field reinforces these parallel tracks, signalling this as relevant to those who have a particular interest in the education of those who sit outside normal educational provision. The dominant discourse that marks, quote, some people as excessive to normative boundaries, therefore appears to be at work in the discussion of education policy, where SEN policy is perceived as excessive to the normative boundaries of Ball's education debate. So examining the policy context between art and design education and SEN recognises this as a shared space where understanding the implications of hegemony, for one, may serve to illuminate the other. So I'm arguing, and actually in another piece of work, have done more of an extensive discussion on arts policy and how policies concerning art education have developed in a particular way that reinforce neoliberal agendas around consumer use of art products as opposed to education, the uses of art education. I won't explore that now, but I'm just drawing on that in terms of this argument for a joint reading of policy. So, on Being Singular Plural, Jean-Luc Nancy's relational ontology, Being With, emphasises the inevitability of recognising this coexistence and is offered as a justification for bringing these seemingly unrelated areas of concern together. And that's where I finished off on the PhD, really, was around this bid to encourage people to engage with contextualised discussion around difference and pedagogy, but to do that through disciplinary contexts. Nancy's work suggests an optimistic perspective from which to interrogate disabling policies by questioning the existence of the individual subject. And Dennis Atkinson, writing about education in art and design, emphasises the usefulness of Nancy's work in understanding the formation of pedagogic relationships, acknowledging that Nancy's recognition of being with is also a thinking with, an approach that is vital in a consideration of education policy, where education and special education are usually reinforced as singular concerns. This philosophical approach resonates with perspectives from critical disability studies that question the focus on independence and the primacy of the individual. It's possible, therefore, that an individualising policy context can still give way to a consideration of cooperation, interdependence, community and society. On Being Singular Plural is useful then for examining proximity and distance in policy formation, where claims to collaboration and participation reinforce the singularity of individual special need. I've not finished the second part, but there's a little aside here where Nancy talks about this relationship which suggests this joining together, but he also recognises in that relational ontology that idea of separation, so the gap that still exists between one and the other. So Nancy recognises difference, saying people are strange, but recognises that everything passes between us. In passing from one to the other, we recognise that there is distance, and our proximity to the other serves to emphasise difference from, but also our relationship with the other. And I'm going to just refer to another direct quote from Nancy, which I'll read. This between, as its name implies, has neither a consistency nor continuity of its own. It does not lead from one to the other. It constitutes no connective tissue, no cement, no bridge. It is neither connected nor unconnected. It falls short of both. Even better, it is that which is at the heart of a connection, the interlacing of strands, whose extremities remain separate, even at the very centre of the knot. So this idea of a knotting, I'm just going to bring in again, this was a drawing that I'd done as part of my MA in art education and practice. So this drawing was very much around knitted forms, and this idea of interlacing forms, this idea of relationships and interconnections, but importantly also the separation. So these things are bound, but by being bound together, we also identify that there are spaces between them. So Nancy recognises this idea that co or with suggests an interconnection that in itself recognises distance. And I think this is perhaps significant in the aims to draw together collaborative voice for policy. So when we're thinking about that idea of drawing in collaborative voice into policy, that we're also recognising processes that are distancing within the way that those voices are framed. And I'll just have that one up now. So again, this was from a similar project, but just to illustrate this idea of interconnection but also distance. The application to policy analysis is significant since the singularity of the fields of art and design education and special education can be acknowledged whilst recognising a relational dimension or plurality. Existence of policy for SEN, although historically removed from mainstream discussions about the sociology of education, for example, is with educational policy and can only be understood as such. And there are a number of authors who've written about this. So Braun, for example, recognised that a focus on individual policies does not take into account the ways in which multiple policy demands and expectations are read in schools and worked with in schools. A consideration of the exclusionary processes at work in policy formation is strengthened when it recognises a range of ways that this is being enacted. It becomes possible to recognise where voices in policy formation are being silenced. So, for example, in the rejection of the global agenda for inclusion in policies relating to special education, can be read alongside other international objectives, for example around creative arts education agenda from UNESCO. So we can see that in the denial of arts-based education through the proposals for the English baccalaureate that has excluded creative subjects from the curriculum. And what I'm arguing there is that there's a range of exclusionary processes which can be read together in order to make sense of them, particularly given the justification for those moves which are around particular ideas about the usefulness of education as being around creating productive workforces. So recognising this shared context therefore enables an examination of potentially exclusionary processes at work in policy formation. So that is probably the longest section, and just hopefully to get across the idea of that, this idea of reading policies together, and also probably that degree of reflexivity in where I'm coming from in terms of reading policy proposals and policy formation. So I'm going to move now to the third part, in which I'm going to just give a very short reading of parts of the foreword from the Green Paper. And I'm going to do this in order to just illustrate the ways in which I'm going to argue that voice is being used, or, as I describe, appropriated. What I mean here is the use of voice as a vehicle for the realisation of neoliberal aims regarding independence, productivity, and a reduction in costly bureaucracy. So I'll talk through that. I'll leave that image on while I do that. So I'm going to go and just read directly from this policy proposal. As I say, this is just the foreword from Support and Aspiration. So this was published in 2011. It's quite dated now. There's Leah did a dissertation on analysis of the recent policies. So you'd probably tell me how many versions there are better than I know. But there have been multiple versions. There's initial proposals in the Green Paper, and then multiple versions of that proposal as that has been developed and revised, which in itself would be a good focus for a talk. But I'm going to just focus on some very small parts of this. And this was originally produced by Michael Gove and Sarah Tether. Obviously, it was one of the first education policies coming from the coalition, so they were very clear on having that as a joint piece, which is interesting in itself, because Sarah Tether very quickly exited for various, I think, cited as personal reasons, and actually knowing more about Michael Gove's policies, quite definitely Gove's voice that comes through here. So I might be wrong about that. So he starts, or they start, with a speaking for. So thinking about, as I'm reading this, if you just think about the ways that voices are being used, and as I say in the first paragraph particularly, that there is a speaking for and on behalf of. This green paper is about all the children and young people in this country who are disabled or identified as having a special educational need. It is about their aspirations and their hopes, their desire to become like every child and young person, independent and successful in their chosen future, and to the greatest extent possible, the author of their own life story. So we recognise this sort of collective representation, some extent unifying ideas around embracing all, but as I'll sort of discuss later, then there's this separation of particular groups within that. And we also see it's quite an emotive use of rhetoric. It's about their families who have consistently called for better support for their children and themselves. Families of the most disabled children who are providing 24-hour care from birth, or the families of children struggling at school who don't know where to turn for help. It is about their teachers, their college lecturers, and the many skilled staff from the health and social care professions who do their best day in and day out to provide the right support and encourage the highest aspirations. And again, there's a real emphasis there on relationships and that connectivity in terms of their teachers, their college lecturers, who do their best day in and day out. And in this next section, a particular attempt to draw everybody on side. It's very difficult to argue with any of the assertions that are made here. People wanted to do their best, wanted to be the best kind of professional in this work. There is much that is excellent in the support for these children, young people and their families. The case studies in this green paper describe just a few examples of inspirational teachers, expert services and world-class practice. Highly skilled professionals who strive to understand the individual needs of every disabled child or child with a special educational need, and to give them the best possible support and best teaching. Experienced managers in health services and local authorities who listen to what families are asking for and work out how the system can respond. And that's quite an important section for bringing professionals on side. It wants to not distance the professional bodies, so it's recognising excellent work that's done with these individual children, and the fact that there are a few examples of inspirational teachers, expert services. And there is a call then for what I'm going to discuss in terms of the ethics of collaboration. So I'll unpick this a little bit in a minute. But we also know that this isn't happening nearly enough. Successive reports, such as the 2006 report of the Education Select Committee and Brian Lamb's report in 2009, have described a system where parents feel they have to battle for the support they need, where they are passed from pillar to post, and where bureaucracy and frustration face them at every step. According to the Council for Disabled Children, on average a disabled child experiences 32 assessments as they grow up. That is unacceptable. Resources that could be spent on support and teaching are diverted into bureaucracy. That is inefficient. Children and young people with SEN don't achieve as they could. By the time they leave school, these young people are more than twice as likely to be out of education, training or employment as those without. That is wrong. We are letting these children and young people down. The case for change is clear. So I'm going to move on to this next section now, where I'm going to talk about this idea about how voice is used here as this act of appropriation. So I'm going to just link back now and talk a little bit about what I mean or understand by that term appropriation, and how we might be reading voice in policy formation as that act of appropriation. Is everybody okay? Still smiling? Okay. Probably not meant to do that, are you? So I've gone back to our mutt and the urinal. There's two images of the urinal here because the original, I think the picture on the left-hand side, although they look the same, this is sort of the point, was the original, and then it was destroyed, but then there's been multiple copies of the same thing made since then. So why does this constitute an act of appropriation? And then more importantly, people might think, well, what does that matter in policy formation? Surely it's more important that we're recognising where systems are not working for disabled children and disabled young people. And there's an argument probably to be had around that close reading of a particular aspect of policy. And surely is it not better to be thinking about what's happening in practical terms? But obviously we all know and understand that the ways that these debates are framed through language are so significant around how we think about our pedagogic encounters. So I'll discuss this as I go on. So, part 4. So why does this constitute an act of appropriation? So as a one-time art educator, I'm bringing the term appropriation to the ways in which voice is used as a rhetorical device in policy formation to drive a collaborative and therefore ethically credible argument for policy change. So in this next section, I want to briefly introduce the term appropriation as a term used in art history, and I'll go on to discuss the relevance to this use of collaborative voice. So, according to the Tate, in terms of the summary or idea of appropriation, appropriation in art and art history refers to the practice of artists using pre-existing objects or images in their art with little transformation from the original. So an example here we talked about already is Fountain by Marcel Duchamp, the presentation of a urinal signed by the invented or imagined artist Mutt, and displayed as a piece of art, forcing us to question how an industrially mass-produced object can have the significance of an original piece of art. And it doesn't go unnoticed that it's also a urinal. So there's connections with taking the piss, I presume, are very evident to people. Okay. So appropriation as art practice was later significantly influenced by Walter Benjamin through a significant piece of work, the work of art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, which I think is 1936, where Benjamin discusses the authority of the original work in an age of mass production, with the move from what he describes as the aura of the unique artwork, and thinking about that in relation, what does that mean then when we have a multiplicity of images or representations? What I'm taking from that, though, is just some key ideas in terms of originality in relation to the object, genuineness, maybe we talk about authenticity, and I'm applying this to voice obviously, and the idea of resignification. So images and artifacts taking on and producing new meanings as they move from the original or authentic, singular, to the many. Okay? And I'll just show you a couple of other examples so people might know these other examples as well. So this is Duchamp's use of Mona Lisa, again taking an iconic image of the Mona Lisa, something that people accept, understand, and then working with that, disrupting that in some way. But the idea is it's working with an idea that's recognised and worked with. And I just really like Robert Rauschenberg, so I wanted to include Robert Rauschenberg lithograph, and this is made up of a print, but it's made up of photographs of real objects that then he repurposes and represents. So we've got this idea of using an actual thing or representation of something, but working with that in ways perhaps that it wasn't originally created for. Okay. Just wondering if David, you can absolutely hammer me on the art theory parts of it. You're not, are you? Because you're kind. Relax. Okay. There's a quote, isn't there, about telling somebody to relax, telling a writer to relax. It's like telling a patient to relax when they're waiting for an enema. Why did that just come into my head? So, yeah, so this idea of, the genuine object or the authentic object, I'll go back to that image, this is also something that's recognised in art and design education. In art education, there's a concern with the ways in which educational practices encourage the reuse of images with too little regard for their original significance. So, for example, in Year 7, so first year of high school, kids often make African masks. Look at that. Which part of Africa have those masks come from? So, Year 7 will use forms and patterns to make African masks, regardless of specific geographical, cultural locations, and even actually sort of ceremonial purposes that may have been originally there. Or Year 8, these are real examples from my experience you might recognise. Year 8 will make dotty paintings inspired by the patterns in Aboriginal art, okay, without attending to the cultural significance of images as dreamings and the relationship with ancestral stories. The emphasis is usually on technical reproduction here of form and pattern, rather than educating children about cultural significance of art and artefacts. And what I'll do as I move into this later section now is to talk about that type of appropriation, or we might call it misappropriation, when we think about voice, and we think about the history of participation and voice and collaboration, and the way that that is used to reinforce other messages in terms of policy formation. So, but what then of my argument for the appropriation of voice in policy formation? The argument for change outlined by Gove and Tether in 2011 in Support and Aspiration ventriloquised the voices and experiences of young people. I'm suggesting that this was an appropriation of voice in order to create a form of dialectic collaboration as a justification for austerity politics. And I'm going to talk about that notion of dialectic collaboration. We can ask then, to what extent was the bid for collaborative voice genuine and authentic? And I'm saying that not because there were a whole range of processes around collaboration, but there were only certain elements around policy formation that would have been up for discussion. So the designation of children as having the label of special education needs, for example, wouldn't be on the table. So it took place within certain very, very set and clear parameters. And I'm questioning then to what extent that there's an entirely collaborative process at play. I'll share with you now then a quote from Brown, who talks about, the paper was actually about collaboration in the formation of art policy in Australia. But he talks about collaboration as falling within a category of ethics, and I'll read this quote. Collaboration falls within the category of ethics. When people collaborate, they're motivated for various reasons to unite in some action. The purposes which people cite as the reason for taking cooperative action also stand as the ethical basis for their collaborations. So thinking around that, we think about this nature of the ethical move for collaboration. The purpose for collaboration is being framed around an ethical response, which we can see clearly in that the quote that I read around this: things need to change. We need your voices. We need to know how we're going to move this forward. And again, the purposes that people cite as the reason for taking cooperative action stand as that ethical basis. So there's a very strong ethical argument that's made for why those changes would be made. But then there are other messages that come through that, which I'll discuss. Collaboration entails some degree of trust in those with whom you cooperate. People qualify as trustworthy to the extent that they are able to reassure you of their commitment to a shared goal. And again, this, in terms of the context, the political context here, we have to read this policy in terms of special education and how we're letting these children down, the changes that were required to be made to provision in special education must be read alongside changes to the living allowance and the bedroom tax. So we've got a range of other social policies that are occurring at the same time, and it must sit within the same ethical framework. We can only read it within that same ethical framework. So there's some contradictions, real contradictions that are happening there. So Brown, in the paper on the role of collaboration in art education, outlines 3 forms of collaboration. And these are dialectical, autonomous, and consultative. And I've just put the definitions that he uses up here, but I'll read these through. Autonomous collaboration is motivated by the need to define facts and investigate missing information. It's investigatory in nature. The aim around autonomous collaboration is to find explanations for things. Consultative collaboration, and this document is framed as consultative collaboration, proposes ends, so suggests that there are changes. There's a need for particular advice, it's creative in nature, and with a move to design what ought to be. So it's that idea about it's creative, it's moving towards what ought to be. But I would argue that the collaboration that's taking place here is sitting around that dialectical collaboration. And this is, a dialectic is essentially oppositional. Defining the problem, identifying that there's a critical imbalance, it's political in nature, and also aligns people with particular ideologies, and with an attempt, again, to change what is wrong. So dialectical collaboration occurs where people institute criticism of some state of affairs by drawing attention within it to problems related to injustice, sectional disadvantage, ignorance of new facts, complacency, negligence, concentration of power, intransigence, and so on. That's a quote. Brown goes on to explain that the dialectic fosters an ideological relationship among groups. So it's a way of bringing in, although people might not agree within that group, it forms an ideological connection. My argument then is that voice is appropriated in order to create a justification for change, and this creates a particular form of being with. So it creates a particular form of relationship between the parties that are cited within the document. And importantly, a particular form of being with where every child who is disabled or identified as having a special educational need deserves our support, so that they, like every other child, can achieve their aspirations. We can only achieve that by working together. And this is an example of this idea of distance, the connectivity, disconnection, where we've got every child who is disabled deserves our support, suggests there's a relational but a particular type of relationship around support. Like every other child, again, there's that discourse of distance within that focus. So, collaboration. I've just put this second to the last image up. This is just what I describe as a thinking drawing, and thinking around collaboration. And there are 2 parts of this, the 2 letterheads from the top of the policy, which is around the Department for Education and the Department for Health. So it's a really significant change in this document, in the legislation, that one of the key parts of the legislation was around bringing together education and healthcare in order to minimise the number of assessments, but also I'm very interested in how that then frames ideas in terms of pedagogic response. So that connection between health and education for me feels very problematic when I'm coming to that from the perspective of an educator. Okay, so I need to be concerned, there needs to be concern with the medical arrangements. It's problematic, and I know there's lots to discuss that, but I'm setting that up as being problematic. And I would question there then, what kinds of pedagogic response relationships are formed around those discourses that bring together health and education in particular ways. And that they bring health and education together in a way where we talk about support, but very rarely talk about education, the education of children. And there are far fewer mentions of learning and teaching, for example, than there are for support. So, collaboration. The voice of the child who is disabled or identified as having a special educational need is appropriated in order to establish a consultative process as a form of dialectical collaboration. Voice is appropriated in order to create a case for change. What is wrong is identified as systemic, but the problematic object of the disabled child as victim of systemic failure is repurposed as an object in the argument for resource efficiency, support and mediation. Our outrage at the poor experiences of these children creates a vehicle for coalition policy objectives. And I'll just return to a significant paragraph here. Now, remembering that this is about policy around education for children, the proposals in this Green Paper are wide-ranging. They cover the circumstances of the child with complex ongoing medical needs and the young person who is falling behind at school. They are part of a wider set of reforms that will benefit this group of families and their children. The introduction of a universal credit will mean that people will be consistently and transparently better off for each hour they work and every pound they earn. Curiously integrated there in policy formation around special education. Reforms to the National Health Service will mean greater freedoms for professionals to take decisions in the best interest of patients, and likewise, our significant changes to education will mean teachers are free to decide what happens in their classrooms and make sure every child is able to benefit from learning. So there, the second part of that, the curious sort of intermingling of policies around social policies around work and the universal credit that are sort of interlacing ideas around education. So, dialectical collaboration potentially as a backdoor for other policy objectives. And curiously, actually, in the actual policy documentation still makes reference to resource inefficiencies and cost savings and the extent of resources that are spent and could be saved in, which is a curious place. It's a definite political pitch around a particular ideology that is very obvious within policy now. I'm finishing with this the final image of the SCN magazine, and the front cover, close up of this face, looks like the face of pity. Quite a young child with a real sort of glistering tear, with the face turned forwards, and with a list of headings: who cares, what does the future hold for children in care, supporting the VI learner, practical tips to aid achievement, without a voice, of course I thought it was topical, are thousands of children being deprived of the communication aids they need. And I think this is quite significant in what's happening within policy proposals. So, on to the conclusion now, which is very short, so we are nearly done with this. Okay, so what is appropriated? Voice is used to represent the problematic object of the child who is disabled or identified as having a special educational need. Appropriation works with the fluidity of meanings, of images and objects. And I want to turn now to the idea of voice. And obviously we've been revisiting this in different ways throughout the different presentations that people have given. There's no fixed meaning to voice. It is itself subject to power, hegemony, and so can be subject to shifts, distortions and resignification. Schneider, discussing processes of cultural appropriation in art, craft and design, describes the role of agency in the appropriation of images, where those who are powerful in the process of appropriation can instigate the suppression or suspension of meaning. Voice is used to appeal for a definition of relationships between children, families and worthy professionals, whilst marking out and isolating the child. There is a constant shift between this process of smothering and othering through policy, which prioritises support. And I'm also reminded here of Robert McCrue's warning earlier in the seminar series about these processes of deep politicisation, when voices are brought in and tamed or put to use for a purpose that is at odds with an original intention. So although devoid of their attention to pedagogy, policy formation reveals and creates dominant discourses that govern the context for learning. Returning to Nancy then, teacher and learner will always remain separate, even at the very heart of the knot, but the reinforcement of need, support and resource implication establishes a fundamentally problematic foundation for collaboration and a poor basis on which to build a pedagogic relationship.